Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 21 of Series 7. The question for today is, what is the aesthetic justification of the world that Nietzsche pursued? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 3. Nietzsche's pursuit of an aesthetic justification relates to questions of human consciousness and value. Aesthetics is an aspect of value, and I focus on value as a way of resolving the problems of consciousness. Also, like Nietzsche, I question the adequacy of ethics as a category for explaining human life. So this skepticism about ethics encourages us to turn towards aesthetics. And significantly, Nietzsche suggests that aesthetics is able to offer answers to the big questions of life. This can be seen in that he repeats such suggestions several times in his works. For example, he writes that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. But what could this mean? And how could aesthetics possibly provide justification? 3 weeks ago, I distinguished immediate and perceptual cognition from analytic and logical cognition. As the first sentence of Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, in which he presents aesthetic justification, he writes, "We shall have gained much for the science of aesthetics once we perceive not merely by logical inference, but with the immediate certainty of vision, and the continuous development of art is bound up with the Apollonian and Dionysian." In this sentence, Nietzsche connects aesthetics and art not only to particular modes of perception suggested above, but he also connects these to Apollonian order and Dionysian frenzy that we will also discuss shortly. Yet to answer the question, what is Nietzsche's aesthetic justification, we need to look first at the standard conception of justification. In the context of ethics, justification means to determine or make something right, good, or give it integrity. Justification is also taken to show something to be right and good, which isn't the same as rectification. Neither is moral justification the same as the validation of something as factually true. There are also different ways in which things might be said to find moral justification. Action might be justified by authority of the state, or by God, or simply by mandate. Secondly, justification might be derived through reason or the coherence of an action. Thirdly, pragmatic justification might be found by choosing the best available option. And lastly, there is subjective justification of an authentic expression of human choice. So there are many ways in which it is thought that justification is actually justified. And justification has a specific meaning in the context of morals or value. But the idea of aesthetic justification is another one of these methods of justification. Yet in addition to these, justification is often and classically claimed due to the truth of a principle. We have previously discussed how we seem to have obligations to the inescapability of truth. Yet we noted both the relativity of truth and that the truth and that the value of truth arises from our association with it. But more significantly here, Nietzsche himself questions the value of truth. And of course, more than just bare truth is needed for human justifications. For example, the truth of 1 + 1 the truth of 1 + 1 = 2 doesn't amount to any moral or ethical justification. In analytic philosophy, the question of justification typically takes place in the context of the cognitive non-cognitive debate. The question here is, are events like motivation and morals explained in terms of cognitive or non-cognitive states? Cognitivists claim that non-cognitive states like feeling cannot guide or direct action, but non-cognitivists claim that cognition is impotent to act without feeling. A leading question here is, do we eat an apple because we desire it, or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively compelling, but questions of moral motivation and justification are more complex and difficult to resolve. Problems of justifying moral values are amongst the reasons why we might look for aesthetic justification. These problems include contradictions between and inadequacies of the various ethical theories. High on this list of problems is again Hume's law or Hume's principle. This is that we cannot derive a prescriptive moral ought from a factual is, or morals from reason. I won't elaborate on this principle again here, except to say that it has never been unseated, and that it is a direct challenge to both Kantian and naturalistic ethics. But I will also briefly mention Mackie's argument that there are no objective values. This argument prevents values from being justified directly from metaphysical or religious sources. These are just a couple out of the many problems facing the justification of values or moral values. But another kind of problem that I previously discussed and noted above is that of ethical theory itself. That is, different ethical theories seem to contradict each other, which throws doubt on the very concept of ethics. And there is not one theory of ethics that is comprehensively viable without deep flaws. I have discussed these issues before, but I can very briefly review the main theories of ethics here. Kantian ethics emphasizes the moral significance of intention, but it incurs problems of justification and motivation in the employment of reason and universalization. These problems become more acute in facing Hume's law or principle. Utilitarianism also faces insuperable problems. These include the inadequacy of happiness as a moral principle. Another is explaining the motivation of an individual for the greater good of others. Again, these aren't arguments, but statements made for the sake of explanation. Aristotle's virtue theory of disposition and character has been received favourably in the modern world, but it is unable to provide clear principles of either explanation or action to guide behaviour. I myself advocate a value theory ethics, which I hope resolves these problems by replacing the virtues with values. But as value theory ethics has not yet been widely accepted, ethical theory in general remains incomplete. Yet Nietzsche has his own criticisms of ethics and their religious foundations in addition to those above. And having demolished religion, traditional ethics and their values, Nietzsche searches for a new foundation. And in looking for this new foundation, as a revaluation of all values, he looks to aesthetics. Nietzsche emphasized aesthetic justification and repeated this view many times with the phrase that the existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. But again, what did he mean by aesthetic justification? Nietzsche's view of aesthetics was different to Kant's rational aesthetics that explained categories of space and time. And Nietzsche's aesthetic included, but went beyond, art, beauty and symmetry. In his standard view of aesthetics, he declared that without music, life would be a mistake. Yet Nietzsche's aesthetics is also about visceral experience, including sensual and sexual experience. Nietzsche is held in a terrible tension between his two votaries of Apollonian and Dionysian art. Apollonian art is represented by beauty, harmony, rational thinking and order, like Apollo, the sun god. Dionysian art represents the frenzy of life, destroying unity but enabling access to mystical insight. But left to themselves, Dionysian forces will fragment and destroy everything in their grip. Nietzsche wanted to use these two forces of order and chaos that were also fundamental to Greek culture. He wanted to integrate these primordial forces with the promise of strength, power and individuation. This is the main theme of his early work, The Birth of Tragedy. So Nietzsche's aesthetic isn't an ordinary one that is just an appreciation of art or beauty. Neither is it just a way of looking at, assessing or even experiencing the world. It is a particular experience and violent engagement with life with certain costs and demands. He describes this process of integrating the Apollonian and the Dionysian in his 3 Metamorphoses of the spirit. The camel bears the burden of knowledge across the arid land. The lion fights for freedom and truth and says no to seductive diversions. The child affirms in innocence and forgetfulness a sacred yes. The spirit now wills its own will. Nietzsche's hyperbolic style compresses so much into short phrases. One idea here is the innocence of the child, in which resentment and antagonism are abolished. Another is the notion of the will to will as the being of becoming and of the will to power. Joseph P. Stern tells us that Nietzsche is offering the image of a child as an aesthetic justification, not beyond good and evil, but beyond all conflict, all antagonisms. Stern adds that Heidegger interprets this as being within the world which is governed by innocence. But academic opinion varies over what Nietzsche means by aesthetic justification, and he himself is uncertain over the future form of his theories of value and aesthetics. He writes that the future task of philosophers is to determine the order and rank among values. Yet Stern and Heidegger, as above, as well as others, also offer their interpretations. In my view, Nietzsche's aesthetic justification also has some similarities with Aristotle's virtue theory. That is, it doesn't focus on the traditional ethical question, what should I do, but how should I be? They both focus instead on the question of what should be my disposition or character. Yet Nietzsche tells us something about his conception of justification when he says that the present must absolutely not be justified by reference to a future. And a similar view is echoed by Sartre when he writes that we have neither behind us nor before us any means of justification or excuse. Both Nietzsche and Sartre call for non-cognitive justification consistent with theories of value and aesthetics. This is also consistent with the obvious but overlooked idea that such experiences can only exist in the present. But my point isn't that such experiences can enjoy a certain value sufficiency in themselves, but that idea is graphically expressed in Nietzsche's idea of an eternal return. Nietzsche relates the idea of an eternal return in the form of a parable. He speaks of himself walking along and a demon coming and whispering in his ear. What if you have to live your life over and over again with every detail repeated? Such immortality wouldn't be a wondrous salvation, but it would be a terrible prospect, worse than oblivion. In order to endure or even enjoy such a fate, one would have to be able to affirm life as it is repeatedly. This is what Nietzsche exhorts us to do in his yea sayings, affirmations, and saying yes to life. The eternal return is a test of whether we have really found a justification of life. This isn't just an academic justification of right and wrong actions. It is an aesthetic or evaluative justification of all existence. So these comments present Nietzsche's aesthetic justification in terms of life experience instead of ethical action. And we have looked at this aesthetic in terms of art, beauty, sensuality, and Dionysian frenzy, as well as in terms of the innocence of a child and in the sufficiency of the present. Nietzsche's aesthetic justification also includes joy or humour in describing himself as the dancing philosopher. I previously reviewed Charles Gray Shaw's Goal of Life, in which he included joy, and I recently attended an existentialist meeting on humour as an aspect of aesthetics. In describing himself as a dancing philosopher, Nietzsche employs a metaphor of lightness, humour and joy. Yet as a metaphor of justification, Nietzsche also speaks of the self-sufficiency of a god. This is the sufficiency of a god which by definition must be a believer's highest value. But of course he also says that I would believe only in a god that knows how to dance. The metaphor of dancing might be thought to refer to a philosophical methodology. This is especially when Nietzsche refers to dancing with the feet, with ideas, with words, and I need to add that one must also be able to dance with the pen. But he reveals that he is speaking about an attitude when he adds that real dancers are the ones who can hear the music in their soul. I could, and sometimes do, use some of these metaphors to support my own principle of value sufficiency. Yet they also, similarly, reveal a multiplicity of features that constitute such a justification. I have previously advocated features like coherence, consistency, quality, and satisfactoriness. Yet as these comments indicate, justification as an answer to existence must be an aesthetic or value experience, but not just as a quality that affords an aesthetic view of life, neither as just an aesthetic experience of life, but as a substantive experience of value that transforms and fortifies one's life. And that transformation or substantiation is alluded to by Nietzsche when he says, those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. But a criticism arises again that this substantial transformation isn't as substantial or profound as thought. That is, the music, art, and the aesthetic experience are previously discussed forms of cognitive framework, and that such cognitive frameworks are supporting an inadequate and insubstantial self. This charge raises the issue that we have discussed elsewhere and don't have time to discuss again here. This difficulty is also one that must be addressed by self-examination and observation of oneself. Yet the variability of human experience necessitates both substantiality and insubstantiality and degrees thereof. Such relations between cognitive states and value states have also been discussed by such as John McDowell. John Mackie is known for his argument that there are no objective values, and he also claims that the value experience is less entrenched with aesthetic value than moral value. But McDowell holds the contrary view, that aesthetic value has greater dependence on cognition than morals. He holds this view due to the minimal effect of the will in aesthetic experiences. That is, the immediate experience of aesthetics do not readily come under the influence of the will, but that we are led to think they do by academic fashionability of choice and decision. Yet McDowell makes a distinction between aesthetic and moral values that Nietzsche or myself allow for. That is, in the manner of the existentialists, we see the distinction as a spectrum rather than a binary difference. And existentialists, as Nietzsche, also tend to regard values as having a larger volitional component. But we must again leave the outcome of this debate for another day. And the big question that we are attempting to answer today is, can aesthetics, or even value, provide the kind of sufficiency that Nietzsche thinks it can? Yet have recently outlined several kinds of sufficiency in order to introduce this question. The principle of sufficient reason calls for adequate explanations or grounds of existence for everything. This meaning of sufficiency includes universality, but not the evaluative aspect Nietzsche is looking for. Next, the sufficiency of pleasure is that it remains pleasurable regardless of beliefs or social disapproval. Happiness is more subject to cognition, but happiness is satisfying in itself without endorsement. But happiness and pleasure also lack the evaluative aspect of sufficiency. I've previously given many examples of mental states that, in my view, do have a sufficiency of value. These are such as self-esteem, maturity, ethical fortitude, heroism, magnanimity and courage. Sufficiency is also a misleading description for a paradoxical property that holds quality over quantity. That is, it can be characterized by absence rather than maximization in altruism, restraint and moderation. Yet the question remains, can aesthetics provide the kind of justification that Nietzsche thinks it does? Remember that justification makes something right, whole, independent or complete. The examples above show this in relation to reason, happiness, pleasure and value. The question is, can aesthetics provide such wholeness in an existential or ontological sense? I don't know that it can, but the question is certainly difficult to avoid. Or put another way, how far can an aesthetic explanation be stretched? We might agree that an increased capacity of value might be able to eliminate guilt or shame, but to eliminate grief in this way seems to be pathological. Such examples appear to endorse McDowell's cognitive interpretation of aesthetic value. But perhaps we have misunderstood Nietzsche's project. Perhaps we are trying to impose classical modes of understanding on a new way of thinking. That is, are we trying to impose a prescriptive morals on a descriptive, amoral view of value? On this view, an aesthetic justification of the world isn't something we use to make the world right. It is rather an aesthetic justification is a consequence of seeing the world in the right way. That is, perhaps it's similar to what Freud called a friendly attitude to the world, or perhaps what Nietzsche himself described as an affirmation of the world. So, as promised, my conclusion to this question isn't conclusive, but we hope that it is enlightening. Yet I would still like to add a couple of other considerations. One is that evaluative justification is classically required to guide and justify human action. Now, classical ethics can be criticized for many omissions, such as neglecting neglecting meaning and purpose. But can Nietzsche's aesthetic justification be criticized for ignoring principles of action? Nietzsche might answer that he's interested in the behaviour of the Superman, not in making rules for people who need them. And a similar answer is given by Aristotle in his virtue theory ethics. That is, the person of good character knows what to do without having formulas to guide him. But the lack of even a tentative principle is one of the criticisms of virtue theory. And it's one reason why I interpret virtue theory as a value theory of ethics. And I would want to give Nietzsche's aesthetic justification the same treatment. That is, to interpret Nietzsche's aesthetic in terms of value. Another consideration is a comparison of Nietzsche's aesthetic justification to experiences of meaning and purpose. I have frequently compared such major human activities as different expressions of value. These were as follows. In religion, God is the believer's highest value, providing both a value focus and a framework of meaning. Ethical principles are values that guide right moral action. Aesthetics calls upon values of beauty, to which we added experience. And a meaningful life is also a valuable and worthwhile life. We can now see that each of these expressions of value offer a different kind of justification. That is, they are making something right, good, correct, or giving it integrity in different ways. And meaning makes human experience right or good in its own particular way. And we can define the character of meaning by comparison and contrast to ethics. Firstly, we can say that meaning in life is susceptible to facts in my life. That is, to find my life's work is useless or my wife doesn't love me can drain my life of meaning. We might argue that it need not, but facts nevertheless usually affect our meaning in life. But ethics has a way of evading facts by saying that my actions were moral because I had good intent. Utilitarians would disagree, but Kantians and others would agree on the significance of moral intent. So, secondly, meaning is an embracing attitude that could be said to colour every aspect of my life. But ethics typically makes judgments about specific aspects of life deemed to be ethical. Virtue theorists would disagree, but even they would distinguish different virtues. The point here, though, is that ethics, meaning and aesthetics are different ways of justifying or making things right, and that the method we employ depends upon how we want to justify things. And that is how I want to leave the question of justification. that particular people with particular concerns, with particular levels of awareness, will need to choose the particular method that suits them. For myself, I find that an aesthetic justification resolves more issues than an ethical justification. As for objective justification, I don't think that such is applicable to human experience. But looking forward, a certain inescapability might be found in the further requirements of value, and I articulate this as a will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. So my conclusion about Nietzsche's aesthetic justification is typically Nietzschean. That is, it is unfinished, but hopefully not without being informative. To begin with, we outlined a number of ways that justification can be said to be justified. These included cognitivist, non-cognitivist and ethical means of justification, as well as reasons why ethical means of justification may not be adequate. Crucially though, Nietzsche's conception of aesthetics went beyond the standards of symmetry and beauty. For Nietzsche, aesthetics calls for an integration between Apollonian harmony and Dionysian frenzy, that this integration reaches beyond conflict to include the innocence of a child. Has Nietzsche's hyperbole here stretched beyond his reach, or must we just interpret his metaphors the best we can? And such is his conception of aesthetic justification, waiting for interpretation. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the workshops or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.